Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, 2020 SANS Enterprise Cloud Incident Response Survey, a panel discussion, sponsored by ExtraHop and Gigamon. My name is Carol Auth of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Chris Dale, SANS Certified Instructor and Founder and Principal Consultant of River Security, Bobby Mazzotti, Senior Security Engineer at Gigamon, and Tanner Payne, Senior Sales Engineer at ExtraHop. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to our presenters.
Thank you very much, Carol. This is Chris Dale speaking, and I'll also enable my web camera so you can see me if you'd like that. Of course, during COVID-19, here we are, well, broadcasting, webcasts, and doing everything from home. I hope you're all safe and healthy out there and that life is treating you good. Today, we have a panel debate where we're going to discuss the results of our incident response survey about, well, incidents in the cloud. So we had a survey out there, we've had a white paper, we had a webcast on this last week, and today we have a panel discussion where we have brought with us some extra speakers. We got Bobby Mazzotti from Gigamon, and we have Tanner Payne from ExtraHop that will help us and support us in, well, discussing the results and having some discussions with us to, well, see where the future is heading in terms of enterprise incident response in the cloud. So I hope you're strapped on. It's going to be very interesting. Let's take a look at some of the most interesting survey results that we found during our survey. So of course, this is a long white paper. I recommend you take a look at the white paper and perhaps also go through the webcast. However, this is some of the core takeaways you could say. For example, organizations are investing in multiple cloud vendors. Nice. That means that they're investing in Azure, perhaps at the same time they're investing in Amazon, they're investing in Office 365, at the same time they're investing in, say, Amazon again. So this is in contrast to shortage of staff and skill. 54.8% of our respondents, well, they put in an answer that said this is our core impediment, shortage of staff and skill. And lack of budgets for tools and technologies at a 50%. And lack of understanding of cloud capabilities is at a 31% response rate in terms of concerns among the respondents. So what are people's concerns? Well, primarily these: shortage of staff and skill, lack of budgets of tools and technology, and lack of understanding of the cloud capabilities. Now, for me at least, I think that this is a bit maybe concerning, considering that we're investing in multiple cloud vendors instead of building up competency and knowledge in one. I'm just putting that out there. Next up, traditional and familiar cloud components are most often breached. For example, EC2, 46.7% involved in breaches, S3 buckets, 43.2%, and file sharing apps, 30%. So traditional and familiar components that we're used to host in our traditional data centers, on-premise, etc., are also what we're seeing breached the most in the cloud. Interesting. Now, is this due to these traditional components have a bigger attack surface? Is it because, well, you have, for example, remote desktop enabled by default in an EC2 virtual machine that you deploy, if it's Windows, of course, and the fact that tailored approaches, things like, for example, containers and things like, for example, functions as a service, they come with a very built-in low attack surface with the least amount of privileges and a lot of built-in segmentation, and it's a bit more easier to control, but they're not that familiar. So that's very interesting. Next up, cloud security breaches often, well, 42.7% not happening. So we're not seeing that when someone breaches into our cloud environments, we don't see our cloud security is breached more than 42.7%. And that number is perhaps a bit high, or you could consider it to be low. It all depends. But for many, 20.8%, it's actually unknown if it's happened or not. So they don't know. They don't have that conclusion that, well, we kicked them out, we're safe. We don't have that knowledge yet. So what we're going to see likely for the future is that attackers and defenders are going to change their tactics, techniques, and procedures to basically, well, help them uncover more threats in terms of have they breached our cloud security or not. And for the attackers, they will be investing in technology, techniques, well, basically tactics that will perhaps facilitate, enable them to breach more components in the cloud and pivot and spread around. So this is some of the things that we talked about in last week's webcast. Now, users, what a surprise, but they are most often impacted. In fact, 74.4% of our respondents said that during an incident, users were the ones impacted. Ooh, and when discovering the effects, when discovering the effects of the incidents, users were impacted, yes. Also, data is a new currency. As you can see here, we had 41.9% say that of the incidents, data exfiltration was most common. So data is being stolen. Thereafter, your data, primarily. Secondary might be other objectives, but with data comes power in terms of threat actors. So data you can do a lot of things with. So that was an interesting finding. Also, we're seeing that the dwell time, meaning that how long time it takes us for us to, well, discover the breach. The dwell time is too high in order to defeat record low breakout times. So from the attacker, so the breakout time is from the attacker has compromised someone's system, and from that compromise, they have spread into other systems. They have stolen something else. They have basically managed to do lateral movement. That's the breakout time, and dwell time is us, well, figuring out have they breached us or not. And what I'm saying is that the cloud can be a great enabler in terms of lowering this dwell time and being able to respond more quickly. And how there are many opportunities. We'll discuss some of them in this webcast today. And also you can see in our previous data that there are opportunities that cloud will give us. Now, first out, before we talk to our panel participants here, let's take a look at the most sought for data in the cloud. What does our respondents want to have in terms of data that will support them in, well, enterprise incident response in the cloud? And we can see that the data types are everything from, say, endpoint data, host domain, URL, reputation data. We got a 21.1% on threat campaign data, which is interesting. However, our respondents, they wanted 38% of them wanted transaction data from encrypted network traffic. That is very, very interesting. And also look at the numbers for virtual network taps and virtual network flows. So our respondents want knowledge about what traverses in encrypted data. And to me, that's a paradox because the cloud is very often shared infrastructure, shared networking, and facilitating this kind of data is not always ideal for the cloud providers. In some cases, well, ideally also you want end-to-end encryption in many cases. So it's kind of like a paradox where we have one side wanting this thing, but it's really hard to provide that thing in the cloud. And without further ado, let's introduce a question to Tanner Payne from ExtraHop. So the survey indicated that many cloud IR professionals want greater access to network data within the cloud for incident response, but they have a hard time accessing it. They especially want visibility into encrypted network traffic, but they can't get it when they need it. How can they achieve greater access to network data, and what value will it provide in the incident response process? Tanner, over to you.
Yeah, great question. So it's no surprise that incident responders want greater access to network data within the cloud, but I'd say the more surprising part is how difficult that can sometimes be. You can't just throw a hardware tap in line and instantly have a copy of all traffic that's traversing that point in the network like you can in an on-prem environment. Then, throw into the mix things like containerized and serverless workloads, and you really have to shift your thinking away from a traditional on-prem data center mentality and look at the options that are on the table. And then with most of the big cloud service providers, they have some type of mirroring capabilities built into their offerings. So Some are on the cusp of releasing or re-releasing this type of capability. And then there's others where it's a simple matter of a few API calls to the CSP in order to get that mirrored traffic flowing to the destination of your choosing. And we can also now tackle the visibility gap within containerized workloads. So for example, today there's several options where you can deploy sidecar containers that function as a tap within a pod to mirror that container to container, that intrapod communication, so you can closely, close that visibility gap with containers. Now, as far as what value it provides to the IR process, so first off, I'd say that, I'll state the obvious. You're now getting packet level visibility within the public cloud, something that's, pretty much on par with what you get on-prem. And another big value here is with out of band network traffic analysis, you can now perform SSL and TLS traffic decryption without the potential production impact of being deployed inline. And with ExtraHop, we also natively decrypt TLS 1.3 that uses perfect forward secrecy by default. So you're really getting full visibility into that, 40+% of east-west traffic that's encrypted within the enterprise or within the cloud. So now let's take an IR specific example, like you mentioned earlier, responding to data exfiltration. So it's one thing to detect data exfil, whether it's by a spike in egress traffic volume or traffic destined for a blacklisted IP or domain, but the reality is that most advanced attackers are first going to break that data into chunks and encrypt it and then exfiltrate it. So even if you do detect that exfiltration, when it comes time for public disclosure or internal damage assessment, if you're not decrypting and inspecting that layer 7 activity associated with those pre-exfiltration steps, so I think MITRE ATT&CK calls it the collection stage, things like data extraction from repositories like databases and file servers, you're really kind of stuck guessing at what was actually stolen. And then, when you overestimate what was stolen, that can obviously damage the business unnecessarily, but also underestimating can do the same or even worse. So when you look at some of the big breaches in the news over the last 5+ years, those where they've reported that 40 million customer records were potentially compromised. And then a week later, they come out with another press release saying, actually, it was up to, but no more than 70 million records. Then a couple weeks go by and there's another one that's, it is actually 150 million customer records involved. That's a series of bad press that no business wants a part of. But when you can actually see it, what select statements were run or what SMB read transactions occurred prior to the exfil, you're much more empowered as a business to accurately estimate the true damage associated with a particular incident.
Thank you. That's some great insight there, Tanner. So it sounds to me like the data is definitively accessible, and like even within like containers and everything, like most of the time this data is within Defender's reach. And what you just said with the capabilities that it gives us during incident response is visibility, especially in terms of, for example, data exfiltration. It will allow us to conclude what actually left and what actually was the scope of the incident, which is an answer that many organizations are struggling to answer. Bobby, do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, so Tanner brings up some good points too. You also have to take a look as to the architectural build out of most companies going from your traditional on-premise client side of the house and moving towards more of a hybrid model where you're starting to increase that attack by 2 times. Really, at the end of the day, you have your traditional on-premise data centers that have their own attack surface. Now you're ultimately increasing the user capabilities into your cloud aspect. So you really have to start taking a look as to where is the best area to start analyzing this type of traffic and really figuring out where is the attacker going to approach most, right? What type of silo does your company fit into from a vertical perspective? Really, where are you looking to ultimately? Are you serving things up to the outside world? What does that ultimately look like from that perspective? And then from the vendor side of the house, really we have to make sure that we are ultimately taking into consideration some of your feedback. You're going to know your environment a lot more. So we are to drive our, build outs and our expansion and roadmap to ultimately cover some of those different areas. As Tanner pointed out, some of the exfil areas, really that can ultimately be the end result of that breach where you're running an investigation report, but you need that data to be able to support that. And ultimately looking at, from an IR perspective of parachuting in, how far and wide did the attacker actually carry out? Some, typical questions I used to ask in, kind of my past life there is, what's the detection trying to tell me? What did the attacker carry out? But what additionally did they do? So being able to actually have access to that data as cloud vendors start to support, especially the larger ones, on different mirroring tactics. Some, as Tanner pointed out, coming re-releasing that capability ultimately is going to allow you to get more data, but not just data. You need it to make sure it's also enriched. Right, just getting data over to your vendor is not ultimately going to build a full story. Really what you need to make sure is that vendor is also enriching the data as much as possible to give you a succinct area where you're not having to spread through too many different tools to ultimately answer that question, what happened in my environment?
Exactly. Well, thank you very much for the insight there. So a nice question brought forward here, and hopefully providing insights to the listeners. And well, basically, our data is accessible. We just have to push the right buttons to look into it. And as Bobby mentioned, have it enriched so that we can actually make actionable decisions on that data. All right, so next up is, a slide on a potential concern, because as I introduced this webcast with, we see a big impediment at many of our organizations that were responding to this survey. And the impediments is very much surrounding shortage of staffing, skills, understanding of cloud capabilities like we just discussed, like the cloud very much does in terms of mature cloud providers. They very much does provide you with the ability to look into, network encrypted network data. So our next question is that the report found that shortage of staffing and skill, 55%, was the top impediment to effective cloud IR in their organizations. There's not enough competency in existing staff, and there's not enough of us. It's a frank reply from one of our respondents. But commonly, not the best solution to a problem. How can vendors help address shortage of staffing and skills in the cloud IR? Bobby, this one is on you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chris. So it's a really good question, right? Historically, we've seen this as a consistent trend throughout news of shortage of staff, ultimately too much on their shoulders. What keeps them up at night, really, at the end of the day? And ultimately, from the CISO's expectation on the executive side of the house, what's the thing that we need to focus on, the next day and the day after that, especially with wearing multiple hats inside the industry. So really, one of the key aspects that we try to focus on is the comprehensive visibility into cloud environments. Where can we best suit our different customers out there, and ultimately trying to address that shortage of staff? Looking at it from the perspective of what data are we ultimately going to pull in? How useful is that information? How can we scale to the customer's attack surface? How can we make sure that we are flexible to ultimately reduce that amount of time that's going to take for that individual person to have to ultimately involve themselves into an actual IR breach or some sort of incident inside their environment? Where can they ultimately look to make sure that they're pulling that back? And as Tanner said in the previous question, the typical TAP is ultimately going to provide some basic information as your physical aspect. When you start getting into the cloud aspect, what is that actual average time to be able to respond to some sort of threat inside the environment? From what we look at from the threat insight side on the Gigmon side is being able to actually advance their search capabilities, looking at it from how can we actually address the breach as it's happening with more ability to have a better response time to that actual investigation. But another thing too is the vendors also need to take a look at it from the perspective of not every vendor's or customer is going to have a security research team. Not every customer is going to have that skill set to be able to be hired. So how can we support that by hiring that skill set to ultimately +1 their extension of their team? Be able to look at a technical account manager, but looking from a TAM perspective or a customer success perspective side of the house, that TAM has to ultimately shift the traditional skill set of what a TAM usually is. Most TAMs are usually somebody that's maintaining an account, giving them some sort of feedback in terms of billing, reporting, things of that nature. But shifting it from a vendor perspective on our side of the house, why don't we place somebody that's actually been in the seat of the customer, has ultimately felt the pain, and can figure out where they actually need to focus their time, help them actually look in the right direction. What I like to say is bring the tackle box to the customer. Teach them how to fish, teach them how to be self-sustaining essentially, to ultimately reduce that gap for those smaller teams, right? That 1 or 2 guys basically that wear multiple hats inside the team are really going to feel the pressure, especially when there potentially might be the roof on fire and there's actually an incident response engagement needed to be done.
Oh yeah, thank you very much for that insight. I mean, it sounds like the vendors you're trying to make the solutions easier and more accessible, and also that the vendors actually have ways in many cases to add to the capabilities and to extend the teams of the customers to enable mutual success and to basically defeat the adversaries before they can reach their objectives. Tanner, do you have any insights for us? Any comments on this one?
Yeah, so Bobby, I like that you brought up the challenge of driving down that average time to respond, whether it's in the cloud or on-prem, especially when a lot of organizations are dealing with, smaller teams, smaller teams than they can, keep up with the alerts. So at XTROP, we really put a ton of focus on giving the analysts as much context as possible when we do surface a detection. I mean, there's literally nothing worse, and I'm speaking from experience, than an alert with no context. It's literally an inefficiency within security operations, because for each of those alerts with no context, an analyst has to spend valuable time understanding what was detected, why it's bad, what assets were involved, were there any other alerts related to the one I'm responding to? So really focus on giving you that context you need to empower your existing analysts to investigate. And this is delivered through an intuitive workflow that kind of strives to make it easy to scope the incident and get to the asset information or the transactions or forensic PCAP in a matter of 0 to 1 click.
Gotcha. I totally hear you. I mean, alert fatigue has been on so many security operations centers' radar, where you're just seeing an influx in alerts where you have literally no clue what to do about them. Like alerts with no context, as you said, we need to make things actionable, and the vendors also held accountable, not just fluffy sales meetings where we see beautiful pew-pew maps and nice, beautiful dashboards, but actually things that are actionable when it comes down to doing the actual work. So I'm so happy to hear that this is a focus where hopefully this will help us address the concern and the skill gap that we're seeing currently being reported to us during the survey. Thank you. So next up here is, well, the cloud has a lot of opportunities, and unfortunately we do see a lot of people moving to the cloud where they're not fully taking advantage of the cloud's capabilities, perhaps because it's not familiar ground or they use it in traditional means. And I'm a bit sad to see that security governance has become like this. The security departments very often have become this department that says, no, you can't have this. You can't have this, you can't have that. And this is the last thing that I want to hear as a business unit or someone running a business. I want to hear, don't tell me you can't. Tell me you can if. And most of the time, there are solutions within reach. For example, we might not be trained to have, for example, fully control of, say, the service bus offering in Azure or Amazon Lambda functions, whatever. However, even though we're not fully trained, the fruits might be so ripe, and it might actually give more benefits by us just jumping into it, doing a proof of concepts, maybe experimenting, perhaps taking a day off work just to study this feature to see if it's basically within our reach. The cloud very often does enable us to have more for less, which is one of the ways to defeat the skill gap, well, the shortage of staff at least. And there are also the multiple benefactors in the cloud where the cloud provider and the vendors, they will work for us in terms of if we get breached, if we get hacked, if we get taken down, it will also impact them and hurt them. So we have this joint mutual beneficial symbiosis of partnership, which is really great for the security of our organizations. Looking at tools and capabilities, this graph here shows us the status quo, where we're basically seeing that EDR and NDR is pretty much highly integrated or partially integrated in today's cloud environments from respondents' organizations' perspectives. We see cloud odd log analysis, for example, at a meager 28.6%, even though these logs very often is within reach, they're not fully integrated in most companies today. We can also take a look at, for example, things like threat hunting, where threat hunting, which is a prominent way, a prominent technique to basically assume breach and look for the inevitable attackers in our environments, it is not integrated it's only integrated at about 17.1% of our organizations, where 38.6% are saying that they have partially integrated threat hunting into their cloud environments and processes. Now, these are not the numbers necessarily that we're looking for, and we are seeing that there exist ways of doing lateral movement inside of the cloud. We are seeing attackers are going to be, well, I foresee attackers are going to be focusing their TTPs in trying to breach and penetrate more of your cloud environment, not just one component, one user, one VM. They want to do that lateral movement for obvious reasons. So next question is actually for Tanner, where we have threat hunting in the cloud has been slow due to the lack of understanding and visibility in the cloud environment. The survey states that cloud environments do not yet support a proper overview of the attack surface without using scripts and tinkering to understand it. What steps can cloud IR teams take to fill this visibility and to understand the gap? Tanner, over to you.
Definitely, and I'll caveat this response with the fact that I love talking about threat hunting, so I'll try to keep this as brief as possible. So the way I see it, one of the biggest challenges in implementing, or rather successfully implementing, something like threat hunting that, by the way, is challenging enough for a lot of organizations to implement on-prem, is understanding what normal looks like in the cloud. There's different architectures, different topologies than that you need to learn or relearn in order to understand before you really get a good grasp of what normal looks like. And then there's visibility. You have limitations in endpoint agent coverage, challenges with network traffic acquisition, and challenges with decryption. And all of these contribute to increased difficulty in applying those familiar and proven threat hunting techniques in the cloud scenario. But on the other hand, you have your list of possible threat hunting outcomes, and the smoking gun is the flashy pie in the sky outcome that everybody is ultimately after. But there's several other threat hunting outcomes that are traditionally considered secondary benefits, but in the cloud and really in the context of this question, these other outcomes can actually prove to be more valuable, because threat hunts, they also expose things like misconfigurations or missing or incomplete data sources, and possibly as valuable or most valuable in this case. With every hunt, your analysts are going to become more familiar with the cloud environment, which feeds back into closing that gap in their understanding of the cloud environment that they're really charged with protecting. So don't discount the value of those exploratory hunts, where the goal is really to focus on a particular data source or an application or an area of the network and just dissect it with the simple goal of learning more about and better understanding the enterprise that they're protecting.
Yeah,
Gotcha,
and I'll add to that as well too, just from the perspective alone of you looking at the threat hunt. Really, when you look at just hunting alone, really take out the idea of threat, looking at it from being able to actually reduce the potential of having a detection fire off, looking at those unknown unknowns, also being able to look at it from a behavioral standpoint. As Tanner pointed out, what's normal from day one to day two? That's really tough for a team to be able to figure out. What is the expectation of what DevOps is actually doing in the cloud, where they're firing things up and tearing things down left and right. Being able to contextually start to understand those individual, just a hunt alone for looking for the unknowns inside your environment are going to reduce that potential for having attacks happen inside your environment. But ultimately speaking to your other team members too, right? Seeing what different divisions within inside those groups. I find the most value when you're actually talking to teams on the systems engineering side of the house, or on the virtualization side of the house. What are they doing? What systems are they firing up? What are the expectations? And then being able to provide context as to what things are they serving up? Are they serving up a bad version of Apache struts that they're just unaware of, has some exploitation that could actually happen inside the environment? So as Tanner said, basically being able to make sure that you can identify what's normal and what's not normal inside the environment is going to be your best way for us to ultimately support you. But we also, as the vendor, need to give you a leg up. Being able to provide you kind of those initial first steps as to what should you hunt inside your environment, looking at a hunting dashboard, what are some low reputation VPS providers that we identified outside of the typical norm.
Sounds good, Bobby. Thank you for that. I hear you and I agree. Like, for me, it sounds like threat hunting here is a process that not only should you be looking for the smoking gun, but it can help build that necessary skill. It can be very valuable to identify weaknesses in processes that, like Bobby mentioned, like introducing a vertible version of struts that can be remedied, that can be defeated with the necessary processes in cloud environments, where you have, for example, as part of your build process, a way to check your dependencies and check to see if we're actually introducing any weaknesses. I think perhaps our audience and even myself should be starting to schedule ourselves up with mandatory threat hunting sessions to, well, just explore and learn and maybe help address that skill gap that we're seeing and the lack of understanding of cloud capabilities. This might actually be something that can help solve those things. Any final comments, Tanner? Okay.
Nope.
So, cool. So next up, traditional components are the most breached. As we introduced with today, here we have the statistics, and typically we see very traditional homebrew solutions like setting up a VM, having it in the cloud. It's all nice and dandy, and we're not necessarily, well, seeing the breach of Kubernetes, of Docker containers, of functions and similar. We're mostly seeing the infrastructure as a service being the primary ways of things getting breached. So that brings us to our final question. By the way, if you have questions to ask an audience here, put them into the chat box and we'll see if we can address them before we finish off today. So this final question here is for Bobby. The report discusses the value of doing out-of-band encryption for security tool analysis, threat hunting, and investigations. However, often this is hard to access and costly to compute for your disparate security solutions. How can this be solved, Bobby?
Sure. Yeah, another good question, right? Really circling around that encrypted data. It's going to become more and more of a bigger pain point as security teams really start to involve themselves with different components like Docker containers, which we've all had the fun of actually deploying and seeing if the code's actually stable in the first place. So I'd say some vendors do key harvesting and decrypt, right? But that means each X different security vendor using some resource to decrypt the same streams over numerous amounts of times. So further, key harvesting means there will be streams that aren't decrypted if the keys aren't harvested, and that's pretty risky, right? That ultimately is increasing potential dwell time for other different types of attacks. Not being able to notice the ones that are considered not so noisy, those low and slow players essentially inside your environment. So as Gigamon, our visibility and analytics fabric really acts as that terminator, really takes a lot of the resource and basically places itself as a different engine to all encrypted traffic. So we don't rely so heavily on key harvesting and really can start to look to decrypt really all the streams. So when we pass a single decrypted stream to any security solution, better yet, some of our NDR capabilities with Threat Insight, it's built into our visibility analytics fabric. Really what you're starting to look like, you don't really need to start to deploy independent sensors when you start to integrate and start collapsing that vendor. One thing we've already seen from the space side of the house from a lot of different customers is they're trying to collapse that vendor gap. When there's too many different tools to ultimately perform essentially the same capabilities, there are going to be some overlaps. Where as an incident responder, where do I look first? One of my biggest issues that I used to deal with is I need to go identify over here as to what the passive DNS information is that I'm collecting over here, then ultimately associate that to the MAC address. And then from there, the initial, SSL, encrypted, traffic, I'm collecting some metadata stream. Once it pops smoke and goes dark, what can I actually, divulge from that information? When you start seeing things utilizing, threat actors utilizing let's encrypt, that's a legit, signature, signer out there. From an incident responder side of the house, how do I defend against that? So you really need to be able to start looking at, less on the key harvesting side of the house, and more looking for your vendors to ultimately provide you that tools to get you that clear context, information into a really, assimilated version of what an incident responder can actually look at, provide context to that actual, detection or that threat hunt, and then from there be able to actually start getting down into the weeds, further and further into that actual investigation, so you can figure out what did the attacker additionally carry out? What was that persistence that they gained inside my environment?
Thank you, Bobby. It does sound very nice, and I can't wait to try and get that visibility myself. Like what I've seen in so many cases is, as an offensive penetration tester, just bypassing some cloud deployments was as simple as switching to HTTPS. And the defenders are blind in terms of trying to stop the attacks, and incident responders as well. Like what actually took place in that stream of data would all be in the logs, but not necessarily any evidence from the network layer. Tanner, do you have any comments on this one?
Yeah, so we see this a lot because we provide out-of-band decryption for SSL and TLS, including 1.3, baked into the product. So in my experience, talking with prospects and customers, decrypting east-west traffic is something that it kind of draws parallels to that cloud fear that we saw 5 or 10 years ago. Back then, it was they perceived it as a business risk to move to the cloud, some of the unknowns as far as moving to a public cloud. And today, that scenario is almost flipped, where it's almost a business risk not to harness the power of the cloud. And the same concept or same parallels can apply to decryption. A lot of them they want it. They want to decrypt and be, from a security standpoint, be able to see into the payload of all that east-west traffic, but they're either scared or unsure of the associated risks. Think PII and compliance aspects that they'd be taking on by decrypting the network traffic. And ultimately, the out-of-band decryption capabilities are there. I think it's only a matter of time before the risk of not decrypting outweighs the risk of actually decrypting traffic.
Great points, because one thing is for sure, like at least what I'm seeing from an incident response perspective, is the threat actors, the bad guys, are winning. Like we need to do more to stop them, and not necessarily compromising on PII, healthcare data, etc., but at least looking into the opportunities that will allow us to, well, defeat breakout times as low as 20 minutes, for example. We need to explore these capabilities much more in depth for the future. And not say that we can't just because, well, the truth is very often we can, we just don't have enough knowledge yet on how to do it safely and properly. So thank you both for your insight. Let me check the Q&A here. Let's take some questions. Let me check the chat to see if I have any questions to us. I see some links to the white paper, and the webcast has been posted in the chat as well. That is beautiful. I do have a question for Bobby. So to better understand the tactics, tools, and procedures, that is the TTPs, that adversaries are using against us, will training, bigger budgets for tech, and more people in the equation be enough? What can vendors do to help our understanding of TTPs and behaviors?
Sure, absolutely. So great question. So training is number one, right? I remember, getting into the IR side of the house, and really actually had to take a step back, was humbled a little bit, because the biggest thing for me was documentation. I had multiple tools out there, but I wasn't great at documentation. One of the biggest things for somebody actually getting into this role is we also need to provide you some of those initial and extra steps. What are the next steps in the event that an actual attack gets carried out? And then from the actual vendor side of the house, We also need to be able to help you identify, stock those threat actor tactics and techniques, start to decompile essentially what we're looking for, but also provide you with the data that we're looking at. One of the biggest things for us is being very transparent as a vendor solution. So anytime we actually fire off a detection, we are showing you what we're looking for. And the reason behind that is that it might be unique to your environment. So you might need to be able to filter out or custom filter for something that you're looking for inside your environment. And that also, comes with the ability to have a technical account manager associated to you. Somebody that you can fire off questions. It's a sounding board, it's a person. Because the biggest thing is having experience with inside, the security realm. It's very far and wide. So getting into the industry, can be very tough, right? It's definitely overwhelming. So we need to be able to provide you ultimately a leg up. So training is going to be key. I took SANS 401 when I first got into, what I would consider, the realm of a practitioner. That was humbling, step as well too. So I can't, devaluate, training is key for you. Even outside of college, right? When you get it outside of college and it's like, hey, we need you to have X, Y, and Z of experience. Well, you need to work with a practitioner that's actually, been in that shoes, felt the pain ultimately of what lowers the shoulders, keeps you up at night. So I can't, training is going to be definitely key, but training on how to utilize the tool, right? Understanding theory is the first step, but being able to have us help you to figure out from a tackle box perspective, being able to fish for those actual threats inside your environment are key. And that speaks to both of us, from the vendor side of the house. We need to make sure that you can utilize the tool and feel comfortable utilizing, the aspects of the tool and how to look for things.
I hear you. What I'm seeing is like this, the whole industry is craving for people, but what we're seeing is that there's a lot of people who want to join, but so many doesn't necessarily have the skills or the interest to, well, seeking to understand. They just want to solve, and so many things within this industry actually require you to understand before trying to solve something, because otherwise there's going to be finger pointing, there's going to be downtime, there's going to be so many consequences if we don't properly understand. So that's some great insight, Bobby. Thank you. Bobby, yeah. Any comments on that one, Tanner?
Yeah, I would just definitely agree with Bobby's heavy emphasis on training. So getting out of college and that typical every job wants 2 years experience as an analyst, but how do you get that experience? Something like SANS training, it gives you a boost to get into a seat to learn further. So it gives you a baseline of what generalized attacker TTPs look like. And then when you get into that position of protecting a specific organization and a specific vertical, you have that foundational knowledge to build off of, and then you have the experience to then identify certain events or actions that are specific to that vertical and respond to those accordingly.
That's great insights. I totally agree. Look for curious people. The people, when you do a job interview with them, they ask you why, how. Those people who wanna get into the details. So I got one more question, and also sending more questions, put them in the chat to me, and we'll see if we have time for them. But this one, I'll let it go to Tanner. How can cloud IR teams change their mindsets to deal with faster attack life cycles and breakout times of the cloud attacks? So embracing automation, or what are we looking at defeating these breakout times that are at a record low at the moment?
Yeah. So the breakout time being the time from an attacker breaking in to when they pivot and continue their attack. So thinking about the difference in on-prem versus cloud environments, they're different vectors for initial compromise, as in the low-hanging fruit in cloud is different than on-prem. With on-prem, you can target specific users with spear phishing and watering holes and social engineering, etc. But on the other hand, the survey shows that with cloud environments, the low-hanging fruit for initial compromise is more in the area of things like misconfiguration and exposed services, APIs, containers. So the entry point here is more of a a static machine versus a dynamic person. So on one hand, cloud initial compromise is harder because you can't leverage that the human factor as heavily, and the attacker they really ultimately must understand the cloud environment as well or better than those who configure and manage it. But then again, on the other hand, you can make the case that it's easier for an attacker in the cloud because say you compromise an API key, there's a much more direct path from the initial entry point to the objective. As in, a lot of times you don't need to spend time trying to figure out as an attacker how to cross that chasm between user land from an accounting laptop to wherever the crown jewels reside. So a much more direct path when it comes to attacking and exploiting cloud environments, and I think that's where you see the lower breakout times coming in to play.
All right, yeah. I mean, the same thing applies to developers, for example. If the threat actor gets access to a developer machine, sometimes that developer has access to the cloud environments. They have cached credentials, allowing you unfederated access to deploying, deleting, just going through all of the data. Bobby, you got any comments on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of piggybacking on what Tanner had mentioned here is there's a couple of areas that you really want to start focusing on is being able to actually protect that data. Where is the actual critical data actually residing? Most cases, some sort of regulation really needs to start coming into place here and identifying some key metrics as to what is your readiness to be able to actually defend against this environment. How fast are you guys moving to a cloud centric build out? Are you still looking at essentially that traditional on-prem and a hybrid connectivity, or are you going full greenfield with a cloud operation? Looking at things like time to actually detect an intrusion, looking at the ability to actually investigate an incident, understanding the criticality or the scope of ultimately your cloud environment, what that actual attack carried out there. And then from the be able to start moving towards something a little bit more mature, looking at the ability to actually detect that intrusion in a certain SLA. You have to start looking at what are the metrics that your team has to be built up against, and do you have the appropriate tools to be able to support that? Looking at kind of what is your considered golden stack of security tool sets, and then ultimately from the training side of the house, is your staff ultimately ready to be able to hit these metrics? The biggest thing from the overall advantage of cloud is that you do have a little bit of a visibility from at least some of the major players to see what assets are happening inside the environment. Start being able to target your VPCs and your direct connects. What is the medium that you essentially connect across? So really making sure that your team is able to hit some sort of SLA that reduces that overall capability and get better over time. Don't just essentially set with these specific metrics, because your attack surface is going to grow exponentially, and especially when you start getting into encrypted traffic, things become a little less noisy. You need to start making sure that you and your vendor are ultimately building the capabilities of what you purchased to ultimately support as your company grows.
Oh, I hear you. Absolutely. That's some great insight there. I would add to that I want to encourage people to not consider it's over when you get hacked. Like, you get hacked, that's another day at the office in my world. It is over when the attackers secure their objective. And what is their objective? Well, as we've seen in the respondents in the survey, as we see online, the focus of threat actors today is to look for your data. Your data is where their objective is. So I think you said it in your introduction, in your answer here, knowing where your data is, their objective, is a great start. And I believe Tanner also alluded to this earlier. How do you identify where your stolen data has been in a breach? Well, there are many ways to secure that data. So I do believe we could take one more question before we'll round off this panel debate here. Bobby, just quick, and we can do a quick response from Tanner as well if he has something to contribute. But pros and cons of NDR, EDR. What are the pros and cons of NDR and EDR?
Yeah, so each purchase has its benefits, right? You made some great purchases when you start looking at EDR and NDR. So the best part, and pros and cons about EDR, right? So you have your atomic indicators, they fire off ultimately what essentially could be a manipulated service inside your individual agent assets. The tough thing with EDR is the deployment methodology. How do you make sure, especially from a work from home situation right now, that all of your individual assets are actually covered? What you ultimately need to start looking at is, what types of operating systems do EDR agents work with and don't work with? NDR can give you a little bit fuller picture. You identify from an EDR perspective what fired at asset A to asset B, but how did the attacker get from asset A to asset B? From persistency gain inside your environment. More visibility with basically being NDR and EDR. When you actually put them together, I like to kind of call them the peanut butter and jelly mix. You have that full context of essentially seeing, hey, from an EDR perspective, I know that this trick bot essentially fired off in this environment here, but I ultimately started to see a Trojan download exponentially reach over to asset B. Is there any communication that made these two actually available? Are there any open ports essentially that had communicated across? And ultimately from there, how can I figure out how far and wide has this actually gone? NDR is definitely a passive solution, so you really need to take a look at what is your full triad of a stack, security stack. What does that ultimately look like for you? The other side of the house is looking at machine learning, right? So from a behavioral perspective, ML is a little bit of a marketing term here, but more what it looks at is what's normal from day one to day two. And EDR essentially will tell you essentially what it knows. NDR is going to tell you how do they actually start to gain access to the other assets inside your environment.
Gotcha. Anything to add, Tanner? We do have time for another question. I'll bring that to you, Tanner, if you want.
Yeah. So, I'll even throw SIM into the mix of that. The pros and cons of NDR and EDR, and I love how Anton Chavakin laid out the, if you've seen it, the SOC visibility triad, where you've got, SIM, EDR, and NDR is kind of the three components of, a security stack, and really kind of changing the conversation away from point products and focusing on data sources. So you've got, the data sources is, when it comes to SIM, they're logs, they're contextual, they can give you access or visibility into things where EDR or NDR can't, but they're also they can be subverted. You can you can evade logging. You can just simply turn it off. So they have their limitations. And then the same goes for EDR. I mean, agent ubiquity is still to be strived for. You can't put an agent on everything. You've got IoT, you've got shadow IT devices that made it through the build process without the proper agents. And then again, advanced attackers have ways of evading or simply turning off or disabling the agent. But then you bring NDR into play, and its data source is network packets, or really the intelligence gained out of analyzing network traffic. And the thing that kind of brings it all together there is you can't turn off the network. That's where NDR really kind of brings that triad together. An attacker, unless they happen to land on the one machine where they have, it has everything that they need to complete their mission, they must use the network to move around and accomplish the mission. And it's a data source that you can't turn off.
No, thank you very much. Yeah, that's a good point. All right, so let's take another question here. Public clouds keep rolling out cloud-native security tools. There are very specialized vendor doing cloud security. What path to take for new users of the cloud, if I understood that question correctly? How about it, Tanner? Any comments on that one?
Yeah, so some of the cloud native security tools that Amazon and Azure and GCP have released, they definitely have their place, and they can give you visibility in certain aspects of the cloud architecture that you may have problems or lack of visibility when it comes to EDR or NDR. But they a lot of times function off their own logs. So when you talk about real-time analysis and detection, something like NDR fed by say ExtraHop fed by Gigamon, or any other VPC traffic mirroring and AWS, you're getting real-time analysis of packets and real-time detections and the ability to respond. Whereas a lot of the cloud native security tools, they're focused on things like VPC flow logs and things that are they're batched and sent for analysis every 5 or 10 minutes. So you're not really getting that real-time analysis that you can save 5 minutes. That may be the difference between data leaving your network and not.
Thank you. What about you, Bobby? Any comments on cloud native security tools versus vendor provided tools?
Yeah, absolutely. So you have to kind of look at where the dedication of that individual cloud provider ultimately looks. Where is their key focus? What's the dedication essentially of that team to that particular type of tool? Is it just an initial get start to kind of reduce that overall hesitation to move to a cloud aspect, or even a tool set? Where you start looking at other vendors that start to specialize in this, really what they're looking for is those gaps, those typical things that we see on-prem, and can those actually traverse to a cloud infrastructure? How can we actually start modeling what things that we've traditionally done as customers, and from that perspective, what does that look like from a cloud-centric side of the house? Are they looking at the Kubernetes or the Docker capabilities today? As Tanner pointed out, looking at sampling data of VPC flows. That's not really going to get you, some of the results that you're looking for in a real-time fashion, which I think overall is kind of the goal of, and from what I've seen from the survey and reading through it, is being able to actually reduce that breakout time. You really start needing to look at things that are a little bit more centric and driven towards your security goals, and being able to be investigate before the breach ultimately happens, or while it happens, right? And don't stop there. Right? Don't look at just strictly just the sampling side of the data that they might provide you, but more look at the ability to continuously monitor your activity inside your cloud environment.
Right. So we only got 4 minutes left, and another question just came in. So let's do it. See if we can be quick about it. So decryption of network traffic for security has issues, as Snowden informed us years ago. When is decryption not preferable? Example, when passwords are passed. And I can add to that not only password score, of course, healthcare data, financial data, things that are protected by regulatory claims. So, Bobby, any comments on that one?
Sure. Yeah. So quickly, obviously being Gigamon and having a visibility fabric, sometimes you need the ability to actually look at it from the perspective, what can you mask before it actually makes it over to your tools for analysis? Being able to actually natively start looking at the different types of data, looking at API data and things of that nature. You need to really start looking at it from what things break down into just basic things like subject headers, an SMTP email. Do they contain customer information or provider information inside there? You need to be able to mask it before it makes it over to the tool for analysis, and then being able to follow regulatory government requirements is obviously a big key. So a lot of the ability to decrypt that traffic, you really need to take a look at what is specific to your governance policies. And with us, we make sure that we can actually mask things out before it actually makes it over to the tool from a security analysis perspective.
Right, and often we are in the clear as well, I would assume, when casting a wide net across the data and not retrieving any identifiable information coming back. We're often in the clear in terms of using that data to produce alerts or items for investigations. Tanner, anything to add?
Yeah, just to add that, like Bobby said, decrypting, the kitchen sink is great, but you are going to run into issues where you're grabbing transactions where passwords are passed in the clear or PHI is passed. So with the ability with Gigamon or ExtraHop, you can at least in the ExtraHop world, you can selectively apply decryption. So you can apply a given decryption mechanism to a specific 5 tuple, so you can avoid unnecessary exposure of PHI or passwords, and then you can also hash out or mask any particular fields that might be sensitive.
Right. So thank you so much for the insight, and thank you for the audience contributing questions and making it very fun and interactive. I hope that it has been entertaining. I hope that we got to bring you some insights in what, not only what the cloud is offering us, but also some of the hurdles, some of the challenges and impediments that luckily it seems like we have good solutions for ahead of us. So thanks to the sponsors, Extra Hop, Gigamon. Thanks to our guests, Bobby and Tanner. It's been great speaking to you. I learned a lot personally, and thanks to all the listeners. See you next time. Carol,
All right,
over to you.
thank you. Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much, Chris, Bobby, and Tanner for your great presentation, and to Extra Hop and Gigamon for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.